Well, welcome. As we continue today, we're going to be moving on down through the list of some 14 different qualifiers that Paul said were not only necessary for a person to serve in the leadership of a church, but also are indications of somebody who is mature in the faith. And the next one is interesting because he said the person can't be given to drunkenness. Now, earlier he used, in the King James, he used the word to be sober-minded. And the sober in that context, as it was used in the original language, meant somebody who has their wits about them. You know, they're not somebody who is given to histrionics or hysteria. They're very they got a stable way of thinking of things. They don't overreact or underreact. There's a balance to them. But here he's talking about the one thing that can really lead to an incredibly unbalanced life. And it doesn't just limit itself to the idea of drunkenness. It's the idea of any kind of substance that we might use that distorts our ability to deal with life in a healthy and helpful and accurate way. The New American Standard Bible translates it this way: it's not addicted to wine, and ESV puts it not a drunkard. And so basically, if you go into the Greek lexicon of the word, it's really not talking about somebody who has a glass of wine at dinner. But basically, the lexicon defines this way: a person who habitually drinks too much and thus becomes a drunkard. And so the Bible's really interesting because although people often say, well, Jesus drank wine, and I think that's probably indisputable just simply because it was much safer for people to drink wine than it was to drink water in many places. But the whole point was wine was not considered a forbidden topic or consumption in the biblical time, but there was a real strong concern about drunkenness, because any place you have a culture where there's alcoholic beverages available, you're going to find there's a certain percentage of the population who are going to really struggle with alcohol. In fact, statistically, what I've read is something like 12% of every population, every country around the world, have people who become addicted to alcohol. They're drunkards. And there's some arguments that can be made that it has some kind of genetic component. One of them is very interesting because the highest percentage of people per capita that drink wine is within the Jewish community, because drinking wine is part of their ritual lifestyle. Basically, their Shabbat dinners and everything, it's part of what they do, if you will. But at the same time, they have the lowest number of alcoholics. Now, whether that's because it's so forbidden and so prescribed in the culture or not, it's not possible to say. But you look at the American Indian population, which actually has the smallest per capita percentage of people who drink alcohol, and you find that those who drink have an extremely high level of alcoholism. And for those of us who live in the part of the country where we have Indian tribes, it's too familiar to see many of the people who are living on the streets, especially before homelessness became so epidemic, who were people who had problems with alcohol and probably should never come near an alcoholic beverage. Now today, with this rampant homelessness taking over many of our cities, even in cities like ours, which aren't big cities, we're only 500,000 people, yet it's really not safe in our inner city in many areas anymore because of the high number of homeless people. But what do we find? We find that 99% of them are people who are struggling with addictions of one kind, especially now with fentanyl. So it's really important that we understand that you can't go up to somebody and say you're not honoring God if you're having a glass of wine with your dinner. You just don't have the biblical basis for saying that. But if you see somebody who is having drink after drink after drink, then you need to probably have a conversation with them, because you cannot drink a lot and not become intoxicated. I mean, that's a simple reality. Your body can only absorb so much alcohol, and the more you add in, the slower your body is to eliminate it, and the more it's going to affect your thinking and your behavior, and of course it leads to all sorts of bad things. In fact, it's in Proverbs that Solomon said that he says, wine is a mocker, strong drink, a brawler, or it makes somebody a brawler, and whoever is intoxicated by it is not wise. Again, it's saying if you become intoxicated by that, or anything else for that matter, it's a problem. Now, I've had people ask me, well, since marijuana is legal, is it all right for me as a Christian to smoke marijuana? And my answer is pretty much the same. You can't smoke a joint without getting intoxicated. And the worst thing is that the intoxicant goes into your body and stays there for 30 days. It lingers. I mean, alcohol will pass through your system 24 hours. It'll be out of your system. But things like marijuana stay in your system for a very, very long time. And we're now beginning to find all sorts of indications that it's responsible for a lot of psychological problems, that it affects people mentally far beyond anything we understood previously, or at least the proponents of making it legal were honest enough to tell us. But again, later on in Proverbs, Solomon he even goes into more detail. He says, who has woes? Chapter 23, verse 29, he says, who has woes, who has sorrow, who has strife, who has complaints, who has needless bruises, who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. In other words, they created their own concoctions of fortified wines, is what they were called when I was a kid. You'd buy these cheap wine bottles called Thunderbird and things like that, and they were basically red wine that had been fortified with alcohol. They added extra alcohol so they would have more of a kick to them. Well, he says these are people, basically, they go sample bowls of mixed wine. They had found ways to enhance the impact. He goes on and says, and don't gaze at the wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, and when it goes down smoothly. He's talking about wine that has become significantly fermented and the alcohol content has been very high. He says, don't sit there and when he talks about gazing at it, he's talking about sitting over a glass and looking into it and partaking of it. He goes on to say, in the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange sights. Your mind will imagine confusing things. You'll be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. In other words, you feel seasick, you get intoxicated, be nauseous. He says, you shout out, they hit me, you will say, but I'm not hurt because your senses are so dulled. They beat me, but I don't feel it. When I wake up, so I can find another drink. He's really an interesting description of somebody who has been totally captured and intoxicated. So the question I always get asked by people, well, is it all right for me to drink wine or any other alcoholic beverage? My answer is, well, you can. You can. Yet you have to ask yourself the question, is that something that's wise? And I say that in reference to Paul's comments to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 6:12, where he says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And there's the key word, mastered. Again, and he goes on later on in the same book, chapter 10, verse 23. He repeats himself. He says, everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. So the questions you have to ask yourself is this something that I can't control? Is this something that's going to take over? I know people have told me, a pastor friend of mine told me one time, he says, I told my congregation, don't offer me a glass of wine when I come to your house, because if I drink it, I'll wake up 3 weeks later in Montana and not know how I got there. In other words, he was an addict, he was an alcoholic, he was a drug addict, and he said, I can't even begin to think about it for a moment because it literally destroyed my life. So it's so important for us to understand that it's something that if you have in any way a sense that you could be mastered by it, then it's something that you should give wide berth. And that's why I think Paul even said to the Romans in Romans 14, he said, it is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything by which our brother stumbles. And that's, again, he says, the faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. The faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is the man who does not condemn himself in what he approves. And I know that may sound real confusing. Again, it's Romans 14, 21, 22, I think, and 23. Read it for yourself, think about it, and meditate on that. But ask yourself the question, are you stumbled by the liberty that you give yourself? Are you stumbling others by the liberty that you give yourself? These are important questions. I think where Warren Wiersbe put it really simply, he said, while total abstinence is not explicitly demanded in the Bible, sobriety is certainly stressed. And I think that's the end of the day. Personally, I just remember my youth. I remember being intoxicated by all sorts of different kinds of substance. And I just don't want to live in a place like that. I don't want to lose that clarity and that preciseness of thinking. So, friends, I can't tell you not to, but I would just say, would you please be cautious? Would you be careful? Don't let yourself be mastered by this. It's taken a lot of people down. God bless you.